You think you know Humphrey Bogart, the cool, tough guy who defined Hollywood's golden age. But beneath that iconic fedora lies a story rarely told. Today, we're diving deep into the untold secrets behind Humphrey Bogart's dark side, the hidden struggles, scandals, and secrets that no one talks about. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just a movie star, he was the movie star. Cool, calculated, with a voice like gravel soaked in whiskey, he became the symbol of rugged masculinity in the golden age of Hollywood. But behind that polished image was a man who spent his entire life wrestling with insecurity, trauma, and chaos. To the public, he was Rick Blaine from Casablanca, the unshakable anti-hero who always had the upper hand. But off camera, Bogart's life told a much darker story, one filled with personal demons, volatile relationships, and inner battles that few ever saw. In fact, the version of Bogart most people think they know is just the surface. He wasn't born into hardship, quite the opposite. His family was wealthy, educated, and well-connected. Yet from an early age, he struggled to feel truly accepted in his own home. His father, a once prominent surgeon, descended into depression and addiction after a failed business venture. His mother, a successful illustrator, was more interested in her career than in raising a son. The result? A young boy left to figure out how to be a man on his own, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. And then there was the incident that haunted him for the rest of his life, an accident that left him with a distinct lisp, often blamed on a Navy injury, but more likely caused by a childhood trauma. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, one thing was clear. Bogart became obsessed with hiding any perceived weakness. He built a persona so convincing that even those closest to him couldn't always tell where the actor ended and the real man began. That stoic, unshakable image? It was armor. And he wore it well. But underneath was someone who felt constantly out of place, too sensitive for his time, too proud to admit it. As his fame grew, so did the contradictions. He was celebrated as a leading man, yet struggled with intense feelings of inadequacy. He was married 4 times, but never seemed to truly trust anyone. And as much as he craved control in his career, his personal life often spiraled out of it. But that's just the beginning. Because once Bogart stepped into the limelight, his demons didn't disappear. They got louder. And what came next would shock even the most die-hard fans. Before the fame, before the fedora and trench coat, Humphrey Bogart was just a boy trying to survive in a household where love was more of an idea than a reality. Born to a well-off family in New York City, you'd think Bogey had a smooth start. But the emotional scars from his childhood ran deep, and they never really healed. His mother, Maud Humphrey, was a famous illustrator, successful, driven, and completely emotionally distant. She reportedly dressed young Humphrey in frilly girls' clothes for her artwork, even using his face for ad campaigns before he could say no. To some, it was harmless. To him, it was humiliating. He hated it. His father, Belmont Bogart, was a once respected surgeon whose career went into a sharp decline after a failed medical practice nearly bankrupted the family. He turned to morphine and alcohol, slowly becoming a shell of the man he once was. Bogart grew up in a house filled with prestige but starved of connection. His parents were more like cold roommates than caretakers. There were no bedtime stories, no father-son fishing trips. Just silence, expectations, and a growing sense that something inside him didn't quite fit. By his teens, he was angry, defiant, and ready to rebel. He bounced from private schools, getting expelled for everything from bad grades to bad attitude. One story even claims he was thrown out of Phillips Academy for throwing a headmaster into a pond. Whether that's fact or Hollywood myth, it matches the restless, rebellious streak that defined his early years. Then came a physical wound that would leave its mark for life. While there's still debate about the cause of his infamous lip scar, the story that stuck was that he got it during a Navy stint in World War I. According to legend, a prisoner he was escorting hit him in the mouth, splitting his lip and damaging a nerve. The result? A slight but permanent lisp that became part of his trademark voice. But some biographers claim the injury happened much earlier, possibly even during a childhood incident his family tried to cover up. Either way, Bogart was self-conscious about it for years, and it fed into his complex relationship with masculinity and control. These early experiences didn't just shape his personality, they hardened it. He learned not to trust easily, not to show weakness, and definitely not to rely on anyone. That mindset would help him become a legend on screen. Off-screen, though, it built a wall no one could fully climb. But the cracks in that wall became much more visible during his turbulent relationships, and one in particular would turn into a public disaster that nearly shattered his career. If there was ever a Hollywood marriage that looked like a slow-motion train wreck, it was Humphrey Bogart and Mayo Method. From the outside, it had all the markings of a dramatic romance. Two strong personalities, both struggling with fame, ego, and heavy drinking. But behind closed doors, their relationship became a battlefield. And the scars it left were more than emotional. Mayo Method was a stage actress with a sharp tongue and a serious temper. She drank as hard as Bogart did, maybe harder. Together, they were volatile, fueled by jealousy, suspicion, and an ever-growing pile of empty bottles. The press gave them a nickname, the Battling Bogarts, and they earned it. Their arguments were legendary. Neighbors reported hearing shouting matches that lasted for hours, glass breaking, and even physical altercations. On more than one occasion, Method allegedly chased Bogart around their house with a knife. She once set his clothes on fire. And instead of walking away, Bogart stayed, at least for a while, claiming he loved her even when she made his life a living nightmare. Why? Part of it was guilt. He'd cheated, repeatedly, and Method knew it. She'd confront him with slurred threats and tearful accusations, which only made things worse. But the other part of it was deeper. Bogart didn't just tolerate chaos, he seemed to expect it. Some believe his unstable childhood made him crave the emotional extremes he got from Mayo. Calm felt unnatural to him. Drama was familiar. The situation hit its lowest point when he began an affair with a much younger woman, Lauren Bacall. At the time, Bacall was just 19. Bogart was 44. And although they met on the set of To Have and Have Not, their chemistry didn't stay on screen. It exploded into real life. But even as the affair intensified, Bogart refused to leave Method. He was torn between guilt and passion, loyalty and escape. For over a year, he bounced between the two women, lying to both, drinking more heavily than ever, and publicly unraveling. The press didn't hold back. Paparazzi caught photos of Bogart with scratches on his face. Tabloids speculated about domestic violence and backroom screaming matches. His image as Hollywood's cool tough guy started to show cracks. People began to wonder, was Bogart just as broken as the characters he played? Eventually, he filed for divorce. But the damage was done. Method never fully recovered. She spiraled into isolation and alcoholism, and years later, she died alone at just 47. Her story became a dark footnote in Bogart's legacy, a chapter he rarely talked about, and one Hollywood tried to forget. But even as he found new love with Bacall, peace didn't come easily. Because Bogart's demons didn't leave with his ex-wife, they followed him into every relationship he ever had. For a man who played cool under pressure, Humphrey Bogart was living in constant inner chaos. His public image was one of total control, a hard-boiled tough guy who always had the last word. But privately, Bogart's life was marked by insecurity, suspicion, and a long trail of rumors that suggested he wasn't nearly as confident as he seemed. Even before he met Lauren Bacall, Bogart's reputation for stepping outside his marriages was no secret. Industry insiders whispered about countless affairs, some casual, others long-running. One of the most persistent stories involved a woman named Verita Bouvier Thompson, a personal hairdresser and close confidant. She claimed they had a secret relationship that lasted for years, even during his most public romances. Whether true or exaggerated, it added another layer to the already complicated picture of his love life. There were also claims, unproven but heavily speculated, that Bogart's countless flings were fueled by something deeper than desire. Some believed he was overcompensating. That behind all the womanizing was a desperate attempt to prove his manhood, to quiet the insecurities he never admitted to anyone. Biographers have hinted at his paranoia over his own sexual performance or even lingering questions about his identity, things Bogart would have never spoken about in his era, especially not in the public eye. To keep the mask from slipping, he leaned into excess, more booze, more women, more bravado. His friend circles knew the drill. Don't bring up the past, don't challenge his ego, and definitely don't suggest he wasn't in control. But even in Hollywood, where image is everything, the cracks were obvious to those who looked closely. Behind the charming smirk and sharp dialogue was a man who couldn't stop proving himself, even when no one was asking him to. One anecdote, shared years later by someone close to the set of The Maltese Falcon, described how Bogart would rehearse scenes obsessively, not to perfect the performance, but to make sure he never looked soft. Everything was calculated to protect the image, to keep people from seeing how anxious he really was about being replaced, rejected, or worse, forgotten. And this pressure didn't just affect his love life. It crept into friendships, career decisions, even the way he walked into a room. Bogart was always performing, even when the cameras weren't rolling. But just as his personal life spiraled behind the scenes, his professional life was headed toward its most high-profile and scandalous romance, one that would change everything about how the world saw him. When Humphrey Bogart met Lauren Bacall on the set of To Have and Have Not, the chemistry was instant and dangerous. She was 19. He was 44. She was just getting her start in Hollywood. He was already a household name. But despite the odds and the scandal, their connection quickly became one of the most talked-about romances in movie history. To the public, it was a fairy tale. The aging leading man finds love with a fresh-faced starlet, and together they become Hollywood royalty. But beneath the glamour, things were far messier. For one, Bogart was still married to Mayo Method when he and Bacall started their affair. And while his marriage had long been a disaster, the timing of his new romance raised plenty of eyebrows. On set, Bogart was captivated by Bacall's poise, her voice, her raw talent. She made him feel younger, sharper, more alive. But what he really found in her was something he hadn't had before: stability. Bacall wasn't chaotic like Mayo. She was calm, collected, and fiercely loyal. And Bogart clung to that like a lifeline. They exchanged passionate letters, hid their meetings from the press, and carried on a secret relationship that was anything but quiet behind the scenes. When Bogart finally left Method and married Bacall in 1945, the media spun it as a happy ending. But some of his friends weren't so sure. They said Bogart had a pattern. He fell hard, he escaped chaos, and then eventually he brought the chaos with him. Despite the age gap, Bacall was no pushover. She challenged Bogart, kept him grounded, and at least for a time, helped him cut back on his worst habits. But their marriage wasn't without strain. His drinking didn't stop, and neither did his jealousy. Bogart was terrified of losing her, especially as her fame began to grow. The idea of being overshadowed by someone he once mentored gnawed at him. Then there were the rumors, whispers that Bacall had grown close to politician Adlai Stevenson during one of Bogart's long shoots. Nothing was ever confirmed, but it sent Bogart into a spiral of insecurity. For a man obsessed with control, even the possibility of betrayal hit a nerve. Still, through it all, they stayed together. Their love was real, but it was also shaped by the same pressure that haunted Bogart's entire life: the need to be seen as strong, desirable, and irreplaceable. And just when it seemed like things might finally settle down, Bogart stepped into a political firestorm that threatened to blow his image apart, this time not because of love, but ideology. In 1947, Humphrey Bogart wasn't just battling personal demons, he walked straight into one of the most explosive political controversies in Hollywood history. At a time when Cold War paranoia was sweeping the country, and the government was cracking down on suspected communists in the film industry, Bogart made a bold move. He stood up against it. At first, alongside other big names like Lauren Bacall, John Huston, and Danny Kaye, Bogart helped form the Committee for the First Amendment. Their mission was to protest the House Un-American Activities Committee WAC, which was dragging screenwriters, directors, and actors in for interrogation, often with flimsy or non-existent evidence. Careers were destroyed, reputations trashed, and the industry was turning on itself. Bogart and Bacall flew to Washington, D.C., joining protests and giving passionate interviews about the danger of censorship and political blacklisting. It was risky. Most stars stayed silent. Bogart didn't. He said it wasn't about politics, it was about freedom. And for a brief moment, he was hailed as a hero for speaking out. But Hollywood's tolerance for bravery was short-lived. As the investigations deepened and pressure from studios and sponsors mounted, Bogart started to feel the heat. Whispers spread that his own career might suffer. Some suggested he had communist sympathies. That terrified him. He'd spent decades building his tough guy brand. Being labeled un-American could ruin everything. Then came the backpedaling. In early 1948, Bogart published an article in Photoplay magazine titled, "I'm No Communist," where he distanced himself from the committee and claimed he'd been misled. He insisted he'd gone to D.C. as a patriot, not a radical. To many, it felt like betrayal. Former allies accused him of caving under pressure. Others saw it as pure survival. The damage lingered. For the rest of his life, Bogart barely spoke about the episode. Some say he regretted backing down. Others believe he felt humiliated for getting involved in something he couldn't control and for being forced to choose between his principles and his career. It was a rare moment where the man who always looked unshakable revealed just how much fear he carried beneath the surface. Not fear of fists or failure, but of being erased, forgotten, cast out. That fear would only grow stronger as the years went on, especially when Bogart's health began to deteriorate in a way he refused to acknowledge, even when the warning signs were impossible to ignore. By the early 1950s, Humphrey Bogart was still a box office draw, still sharp, still the tough guy everyone expected. But behind the scenes, his body was beginning to betray him, and he refused to face it. Just like he'd hidden emotional wounds for decades, Bogart now tried to hide something far more serious: cancer. It started with a persistent cough, one he brushed off as nothing. He kept smoking 2 to 3 packs a day, kept drinking, kept filming. Friends noticed he was losing weight. He looked pale, tired, older than his years. But whenever someone asked, Bogart would joke it off or change the subject. Admitting weakness? That wasn't his style. In 1956, he was finally diagnosed with esophageal cancer. By then, the disease had already advanced. Surgery was the only option, but even then, it was a long shot. He went under the knife and lost much of his esophagus, 2 lymph nodes, and a rib. For a while, there was hope. He put on a brave face, made public appearances, and tried to convince everyone he was on the mend. But the truth was far darker. Bogart was fading. The man who had once owned every room now couldn't walk across one without gasping for breath. He wasted away to 80 pounds. He could barely eat, barely speak. And yet, he still refused to let most of Hollywood see him like that. Only his closest friends were allowed near during his final months: Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and of course, Bacall. But even then, Bogart kept up the act as long as he could. When Tracy came to visit, Bogart quipped, "Hey, Spence, I shit you not. I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." Classic bogey, joking through pain, laughing in the face of death. He died on January 14, 1957, at the age of 57. The press called it the end of an era. Hollywood mourned. Fans around the world grieved. But very few knew just how much Bogart had suffered or how much he'd hidden from the people closest to him. His funeral was small by Hollywood standards, and per his request, casual. He was buried with a tiny golden whistle Bacall had given him during their early days together, engraved with a message only they truly understood: "If you want anything, just whistle." It was a nod to their first film and their complicated, passionate love. But as the curtain fell on Bogart's life, questions remained. What would have happened if he'd faced his demons sooner? Or if he'd lived long enough to confront the myths Hollywood built around him? The answers, like much of his life, were taken to the grave. Even at the peak of his fame, Humphrey Bogart never fully fit the mold of a Hollywood star. He didn't have the golden looks of a Cary Grant or the polish of a Clark Gable. He wasn't charming in a traditional sense. He was rough, sarcastic, and often dismissive. But that's exactly why audiences loved him. He wasn't perfect. He was real, or at least he seemed that way. Behind the scenes, though, Bogart had a complicated relationship with the very industry that made him famous. He hated the phoniness of studio politics, the forced smiles, and the way stars were expected to play nice no matter what. He was outspoken, opinionated, and didn't care much for the social climbing that came with Hollywood parties. In fact, he openly mocked it. He was known for showing up to black tie events in rumpled suits or skipping them entirely. He once said, "The only thing you owe the public is a good performance." That attitude earned him respect and enemies. Executives found him difficult to manage. Directors sometimes called him combative. He was never the kind of actor you could push around. Still, Bogart had his own tribe, the Rat Pack, before it was cool. Long before Frank Sinatra took over the term, Bogey's version included a loose group of rebellious artists, hard drinkers, and sharp tongues who called themselves the Holmby Hills Rat Pack. They weren't about glamour, they were about grit. For Bogart, that was the point. But being the outsider came at a cost. Bogart was always watching his back. He knew how quickly the industry could turn on you. One bad headline, one misstep, and the same machine that made you a legend would grind you into nothing. That paranoia fed into his persona. the lone wolf, the misunderstood anti-hero, the guy who knew the rules but refused to follow them. And yet, Bogart never fully rejected Hollywood. He needed it just as much as it needed him. He craved recognition despite pretending not to. He wanted his work to matter, to last. And perhaps more than anything, he wanted to be remembered, not just for the roles he played, but for the man he believed he really was underneath them. Today, that image still lingers. The cigarette, the fedora, the gravel voice. But the real Bogart, the flawed, fragile, brilliant, and broken man, is a much harder picture to paint. And in some ways, that's exactly how he wanted it. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just a movie star, he was a myth. But that myth was built on contradiction. He played heroes who didn't want to be heroes. Lovers who couldn't say, "I love you." Rebels who followed their own rules but somehow always did the right thing in the end. And in many ways, that was Bogart himself. Complicated, conflicted, and constantly trying to reconcile the man he was with the man the world believed him to be. On screen, he made cynicism look noble. Off-screen, he struggled with the same fears and insecurities his characters battled. He was both admired and isolated. He had friends, but very few people who really knew him. Even Bacall, his closest companion, would later say that parts of Bogart were locked away forever, places he didn't let anyone in. What made Bogart timeless wasn't perfection. It was presence. He had a way of commanding attention without asking for it, of making silence feel louder than any line of dialogue. But that strength was often fueled by pain, the kind of pain he kept buried beneath sarcasm, booze, and bravado. Even decades after his death, actors still study his performances, trying to figure out how he did it, how he could say so little and still say everything. But maybe the real question isn't how, maybe it's why. Why did Bogart need to be seen that way? Why did he fight so hard to control the story around him, even as his life fell apart behind the scenes? The truth is, Bogart's legacy isn't just about movies, it's about masks. The ones we wear, the ones we hide behind, and the ones we start to believe are real. For Bogart, the mask became the man. And once the cameras stopped rolling, there wasn't much left to take off. But that's also why he endures. Because people don't just watch Bogart, they relate to him. Not the icon, but the imperfection. The sense of being tough on the outside and lost on the inside. The quiet rage, the deep longing, the need to be remembered for more than just the role you were assigned. That's what makes his story more than history. It makes it human. Humphrey Bogart's story isn't just a Hollywood legend. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in charisma and tragedy. Behind the iconic lines and unforgettable roles, there's a man who struggled with the very things many of us face: fear of failure, loneliness, and the need to protect a fragile ego. What Bogart teaches us isn't about how to be cool or tough. It's about the cost of never showing your true self. The price of keeping pain hidden behind a smirk and a cigarette. His life asks a question we rarely want to answer: how long can you keep pretending before it breaks you? He never fully escaped his demons, and in that, there's a lesson about the limits of fame and image. No amount of stardom can heal what's broken inside. The darker side of Bogart's life, the secrets, the regrets, the moments no one talks about, remind us that even legends are human. But there's also hope in his story. Bogart found love with Lauren Bacall. He stood up for what he believed in, even when it scared him. And he left behind a body of work that still inspires. His flaws make his strengths more real, his mistakes more relatable. Maybe that's why we keep coming back to Bogart, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest in his imperfection. Because behind the tough exterior was a man who, like all of us, just wanted to be seen and understood. So next time you watch Casablanca or The Big Sleep, remember there's more to the man behind the fedora than the legend. There's a story that's raw, complicated, and real, a story no one ever really talks about. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Humphrey Bogart's story reminds us that even legends have shadows, hidden struggles and secrets that shape who they really are. The untold side of Bogart is a reminder that behind every icon is a human being, flawed and complicated. If you enjoyed uncovering the untold secrets behind Humphrey Bogart's dark side, hit like and subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.